Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the UBS Center for Economics in Society, I would like to welcome you to today's lecture. A warm welcome also to those who are joining us online via live stream. My name is Ernst Fehr, and I'm a professor of economics here at the University of Zurich, and I'm also the director of the UBS Center for Economics in Society, an associated institute of the Department of Economics. Rarely have I been so pleased about the change of venue. We had so many registrations that we had to move to a larger room. Having so many people here tonight is wonderful and is fully in line with the UBS Center's aim of providing a platform for dialogue for a broad audience. Our speaker today is Professor Douglas Bernheim from Stanford University. When introducing Doug Bernheim, I think it is appropriate to say a few things about how economic science, economics as a discipline, has developed over the last few decades. When I studied economics as a master and doctoral student in the 1970s and early 1980s, economics was a very different discipline compared to today. We were interested in inflation, unemployment, international trade, exchange rates, general equilibrium theory, or how industries are organized and evolve. To be sure, economists today are still interested in these important issues, but the scope and breadth of topics in which we are interested is now much, much larger. Today, economists are, for example, also interested in the role of social norms in social and economic life and how these norms develop and are enforced. In this regard, we greatly overlap with sociology and anthropology. We are also interested in the reasons why people become addicted to certain substances and how one can best help people to mitigate or remove their addictions. In this regard, economics overlaps with clinical psychology and neuroscience. Or we are interested in why people make mistakes in their choices and how imperfect perception, imperfect memories, and imperfect attention shape these mistakes. In this regard, economics overlaps with the psychology and neuroscience of perception, attention, and memory. And of course, economists have now already for a long time been interested in so-called non-economic values and preferences, such as preferences for fairness, honesty, and equality. In this regard, we greatly overlap with social psychology. In my view, and in the view of many observers, these developments, taken together, constitute a radical, perhaps even a revolutionary change in our discipline. And as a consequence, economics has become a much, much more interesting and useful science. The scope and the depth of economics has been vastly improved and widened. I mentioned these developments because Doug Bernheim has been an important contributor to these developments. He has written seminal papers on social norms and the role of conformity, and has developed a behavioral theory, economic theory of addiction. He has been at the forefront of thinking in a thorough and principled way about preference change, and has developed a theory of preference change. In addition, he has greatly contributed to the debate on the role of neuroscience in economics and became famous by formulating what is today called the Bernheim challenge. You know, you become really famous if some big thing is named after you. And that's called the Bernheim challenge now. And the Bernheim challenge defines the conditions and the insights that need to be provided by neuroeconomists and neuroscientists in order to have an important impact in economics. And I think it's still a challenge that needs to be met. And finally, which brings me to today's topic, he has been a key, perhaps the key player in the field of behavioral public policy, the study of human choice mistakes and their implications for public policy. This involves questions such as when should the government correct people's mistakes, and when are such interventions improving the welfare of the people. These examples all illustrate Doug's enormous influence on the reshaping of economics. You can be sure If he tackles a new question, he will dig very deep and develop deep answers. For all these reasons, Doug will receive this coming Saturday an honorary doctorate from the University of Zurich, which also provides the opportunity to have him here today. Doug has also strong connections to our university that go beyond his intellectual influence. He has a regular research cooperation with his former graduate student Sandro Ambühl, who is now UBS Foundation Assistant Professor at our department. Together they produce stunning papers and insights on novel and important topics, such as the role of paternalism in human choice. Doug is also a former colleague of our current department chairman, Florian Scheuer, whom we successfully could lure away from Stanford to Zurich. Florian is the UBS Foundation Professor of Economics of Institutions. Now, before we give Doug the floor, let me give you some technical information. You have the opportunity to ask questions if you go to menti.com and dial in with the code 899714444. 899714444. On this platform, you can ask questions for our live question and answer session at the end of Doug's presentation. And even if you don't have any questions, you can still log in and see all the submitted questions and also vote for the best ones by giving them a thumbs up. But now it's time to leave the floor to Doug Bernheim. We are all very curious to hear how behavioral economics can improve people's lives. Doug, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ernst, for that extremely generous introduction. I barely recognized myself. Ernst and I have known each other for a long time, and like virtually everyone else, I have enormous respect for his many foundational contributions to our disciplines. So I'm deeply honored that even a portion of that is reciprocated. I'm also honored to be a part of the Dies Academicus celebrations for the University of Zurich. This is a special place, and I've often said to other people that it's one of my favorite economics departments. It's filled with tremendously talented and influential faculty, some of whom Ernst mentioned, which is why my invitation to participate in this celebration was so meaningful to me. Turning then to my material, over the last 15 years or so, there has been an explosion of interest in harnessing behavioral economics to improve people's lives. The research in this area has inspired a wide variety of public policies throughout the world and influenced business strategies among numerous private firms. And as Ernst mentioned, some have gone so far as to describe these developments as the behavioral revolution. In the public sector, major behavioral public policy initiatives have been introduced in at least a dozen countries around the world, and in a number of cases, institutions have been created to ensure that behavioral insights guide policy design. The most prominent among these is the Behavioral Insights Team, which was originally created as part of the UK government in 2010, but has now evolved into a semi-independent organization that operates throughout the world. In the United States, the, whoops, I went the wrong way, I'm sorry. In the United States, there is a growing reliance on behavioral insights that was institutionalized through an executive order issued by then President Barack Obama in 2015. And the preamble to the executive order articulates the guiding principles. A growing body of evidence demonstrates that behavioral science insights, research findings from fields such as behavioral economics and psychology about how people make decisions and act on them, can be used to design government policies to better serve the American people. The order goes on to direct departments and agencies to find applications, to test and evaluate them, to integrate behavioral science experts into policymaking, and to strengthen ties with the research community. Now, as I discuss this behavioral public policy agenda, it will be useful to have in mind a few examples of these sorts of policies. The first example consists of sin taxes. And the idea of sin tax is just to impose a financial levy on some good or activity that's considered undesirable. So the main examples of these historically have been taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, gambling, and most recently, sugary drinks. The map on the bottom of this figure shows sugary drink taxes throughout the world. These are now spreading. The map on the right shows cigarette taxes in Europe. Another large class of policies are grouped together under the heading of nudges. And the idea of a nudge was popularized by Nobel laureate Richard Thaler along with Cass Sunstein, particularly in their book titled, of course, Nudge, which was published 16 years ago and has now literally sold millions of copies. This is kind of the Bible of behavioral public policy. Their definition of a nudge is any aspect, I'm sorry, I lost my place in my notes. Any aspect of the choice architecture, and by choice architecture, they mean the context within which a choice is made, that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. Nudges, they write, are not taxes, fines, subsidies, bans, or mandates. We will return to that last sentence very shortly. One of the best known examples of a behavioral public policy is the Save More Tomorrow program. And the motivation for this program comes from the low levels of saving that are observed among many households in the United States. This program uses various psychological devices to encourage greater saving through pension plans. Specifically, it invites participants to commit to future increases in retirement contributions that will be synchronized with subsequent increases in their pay. And that way they never see a decline in their take-home pay as they save more. Once they choose the option, inertia tends to sustain their choices. Now, an important class of nudge are nudges that are designed to promote healthier habits. And this slide shows some creative strategies for encouraging people to take the stairs instead of an escalator or an elevator. I particularly like the one on the left, which I wonder how many people see this and start running laps around the escalator. While some nudges encourage behavior that's considered desirable, other nudges discourage options that are thought to be undesirable. A good example is shown on the left of this slide, and this is mandated packaging of cigarettes in Canada. It includes disturbing images on the packages, as well as messages that are written on every cigarette to discourage people from smoking. The right shows a strategy for targeting the use of plastic bags that harnesses concerns about embarrassment and social approval. And there are many other examples along these lines. Now, the policies that I've described don't fall within the scope of standard traditional economics. Standard economics starts from the premise that people are rational and they make the best decisions for themselves. Dating back to Adam Smith, economists recognize that the pursuit of independent self-interest can actually benefit society generally as long as it's disciplined by competitive markets. But there are many settings in which markets don't work well or don't even exist. And conventional economics prescribes policy solutions to those problems, involving instruments such as taxes and subsidies, public expenditure, information disclosure requirements, certain forms of regulation, and so forth. Here I give the example of financing public infrastructure, in particular highway construction. That's a good example. A highway is an example of what economists call a public good. Private markets don't provide highways. The government has to step in to make that happen. Now, from this starting point, behavioral public policy branches out into several additional directions. First of all, some behavioral policies use traditional economic instruments to pursue new behavioral objectives. Now, what are those objectives? Well, the behavioral perspective rejects the view that people are necessarily fully rational and that they always make the decisions that are best for themselves. They're fallible. They make mistakes. Typically, but not always, one of the objectives behind a behaviorally motivated public policy is to stop people from making these bad decisions. Sin taxes, including cigarette taxes, fall into this category, traditional instruments designed to pursue behavioral objectives. Now, behavioral research also identifies entirely new classes of public policies, nudges being the most prominent among them. And these policies influence behavior by leveraging psychological influences. If everyone was a traditional, rational economic decision maker, then these sorts of policies would either have no effect or they would have very different effects than the ones that nudgers envision. Sometimes these non-traditional policy instruments are used to pursue traditional economic objectives like energy conservation. But in other cases, non-traditional policy instruments are used to promote non-standard behavioral objectives. So the Save More Tomorrow program that I mentioned earlier is a good example. Its objective is to improve the quality of financial decision-making, to help people avoid financial mistakes by pulling on the psychological levers that motivate saving. Now, if you just take this figure in, one thing that it shows is that there are three distinct categories of behavioral public policies, and they're differentiated according to whether the objectives, the policy instruments, or both are behavioral, non-standard. And a possible implication of this figure is that behavioral economics and psychology have opened up all sorts of promising new roles for government. And there's a great deal of excitement among advocates of behavioral public policy who see these new tools and new perspectives as opening up opportunities for improving people's lives. However, and there is a however, when I listen to the most enthusiastic or aggressive of these advocates, I'm sometimes reminded of a famous scene from the blockbuster movie Jurassic Park. And in the scene, Dr. Ian Malcolm, who's played by Jeff Goldblum, warns that bringing dinosaurs back to life could have unintended consequences. And he sums it up with the famous line, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." Now, at this point, some of you may be wondering if I'm about to express opposition to all behavioral public policy. I'm not. And to be fair, many of the advocates of these policies do pose the should question, not just the could question. Rather, my position is that the should question is not being asked often enough, that it usually isn't being asked in the right way, and that the answers that are given are often superficial and conceptually flawed. So should this, I'm having trouble with my slides here. Yes. Should this worry us? Well, if we think that personal liberty is an important value, then it might. My own thinking about the proper role for government is certainly influenced by John Stuart Mill, who famously wrote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized society against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others, to do so would be wise or even right." Now, Mill certainly believed that government has legitimate and essential roles to play, for example, in preventing harm to others. And it's easy to reconcile his philosophical positions with the pursuit of many of the traditional economic objectives I mentioned earlier. But what about the behavioral objectives? Mill's explicit position was that a person cannot be rightfully compelled to do or forbear for his own good, or because it will make him happier. And yet, that's precisely what much of behavioral public policy seeks to accomplish. So if we stand with this interpretation of Mill, the legitimate scope for behavioral public policy would become much more limited, as this slide shows. We would still be able to use behavioral tools to influence each individual's behavior in ways that benefits or avoids harm to others, but we wouldn't be able to justify a policy on the grounds that it steers a fallible decision maker toward a better choice. So should the policies that pursue behavioral objectives be out of bounds, as this slide suggests? Well, not necessarily. There is, of course, no reason why our conception of personal liberty has to coincide exactly with Mill's. And indeed, advocates of behavioral public policy often characterize the policies they champion as liberty-preserving. So Thaler and Sunstein's work on nudges is a good example. They write, "We welcome you to our movement, libertarian paternalism. We strive to design policies that maintain or increase freedom of choice. When we use the term libertarian to modify the word paternalism, we simply mean liberty-preserving. Libertarian paternalists want to make it easy for people to go their own way. They do not want to burden those who want to exercise their freedom." Well, that sounds okay so far. What about the paternalism part? They continue. "The paternalistic aspect lies in the claim that it is legitimate for choice architects, policymakers, people running firms, to try to influence people's behavior in order to make their lives longer, healthier, and better." And on the surface, that sounds fine too. But there's a lot packed into that last word, better. One of Mill's main points is that better is in the eye of the beholder. Mill's proposed limit on government intervention is intended as a social guardrail designed to protect against tyranny. And we can abandon it if we like, but then we need another guardrail to stop us from going over the cliff. And I think that now more than ever, it's important to establish liberty-preserving guardrails given the authoritarian turn in world politics. Now, in fairness, Thaler and Sunstein tried to provide a guardrail. They clarify that a better choice is one the individual would make based on their own objectives if they were entirely rational. But here's where things get slippery. They don't offer an objective way to determine whether a choice is rational or irrational. If I have license to declare a choice to be irrational whenever I disagree with it, well, then I get to decide what better means for you, and there are no guardrails. Separately, Thaler and Sunstein argue that at least where nudges are concerned, behavioral public policy poses almost no risk to personal freedom. And this is the quote that I had up before. A nudge, they say, is not a tax. But that is simply wrong. A campaign to discourage cigarette smoking through disturbing images and social pressure aims to shape behavior by psychologically penalizing transgressors. The penalty is no less a tax, and its effects no less coercive, simply because the consequences are non-monetary. Thaler and Sunstein write that nudges are different because people are free to ignore them. But that's just another way of saying that someone could decide to pay the psychological tax and continue the undesired behavior. Similarly, they could decide to pay financial sin taxes and continue the disapproved behavior. Even bans have the same feature. As any consumer of illicit substances can testify, you can ignore a ban and accept the consequences. That's just a tax. Furthermore, psychological taxes can feel more invasive than financial taxes or bans, which are at least indiscriminate and impersonal. Another defense of nudges is that even if they are, in some sense, taxes, many of them are gentle, which means that they're small taxes. But financial taxes can also be small. And if you think a psychological tax exerts a more powerful effect on behavior than a small financial tax, you're probably kidding yourself about the size of the psychological tax. Furthermore, the financial tax is clearly better than the psychological tax in one important respect. It raises revenue. The psychological tax imposes costs without raising any revenue. Now, in light of these considerations, some commentators understandably fear that the behavioral policy agenda might license policymakers to set the contours of good behavior and then engage in essentially social engineering by deploying an arsenal of demonstrably powerful policy instruments, not just taxes and subsidies, mandates and bans, but also myriad psychologically coercive aspects of choice architecture, such as social acceptability. So the concern for some is that a policymaker who targets sugary drinks, believing that they are objectively bad, might offer similar justifications for softly coercing other choices, such as participation in extreme sports, which are objectively dangerous, or even more controversially, influencing sexual orientation or even religion. Where does one draw the line? What is the criterion for judging whether the policymaker's evaluation of the good and the bad, the rational and the irrational, is objective, and whether the intervention goes too far given its purported benefits? The main class of behavioral public policies that pose potential threats to liberty aim to correct people's bad decisions, their mistakes. So, if we want to do that, and I think we do in many instances want to do that, if we want to do that, what we require is a guardrail based on an objective definition of mistakes, one that cannot be easily twisted into encompassing subjective disagreements about the good and the bad, the rational and the irrational. So let's start with an easy case. This illustration shows, that's my personal avatar. And so this is me choosing between two boxes. One is orange and one is yellow. And to make this choice, I have to think about what might be in the boxes. And as it happens, I think the orange box contains oranges and the yellow box contains bananas. Now, because I like bananas more than oranges, I choose the yellow box. But as it turns out, my belief is wrong. The yellow box contains pears. And furthermore, had I been aware of this fact, I would have chosen the orange box. So this choice, my original choice, is obviously a mistake. It's based on a misconception about the choice problem I'm facing. And in my writing, I refer to this type of mistake as characterization failure. The individual has to characterize a decision problem, what the options are, what consequences they lead to before making a decision. In this case, I'm characterizing the problem incorrectly. That's why it's characterization failure. So let's continue to explore this definition of a mistake and see if we can place any objective limits on it. Let's say that instead of choosing between an orange box and a yellow box, I choose between oranges and bananas. If I choose bananas here, could that be a mistake? Well, sure it could, by the same definition of a mistake. Bananas and oranges are like boxes. When we eat them, we're opening the boxes. They provide nutrients, flavors, textures. The rest of this is just packaging. So the way I think about it, I'm sorry, my slides did it again. Okay. The way I think about it, this is like opening a Russian doll. When considering boxes, we could be wrong about the fruit that are inside. And when considering the fruit, we could be wrong about the flavors and the textures and so forth that they provide. And when considering the nutrients, flavors, and textures, we could be wrong about the mental states that they induce. But it stops there. Okay, I may care about boxes, fruit, and nutrients indirectly because they provide me with something else that I care about. But I care about my mental states intrinsically. If I prefer one set of mental states to another, it can't be that I'm wrong about their consequences. They are the consequences. So when I express my preferences over mental states, as illustrated in this figure, I can't be suffering from characterization failure. Could my preferences over mental states be mistaken for some other reason, in some other fashion? It's actually pretty hard to make that case. My subjective internal experience is private and not directly observable by others. That means that I am the world's leading expert, arguably the only expert on my own mental states, on my own internal subjective experience. If someone disagrees with the choices that I'm making about what's going on in my own head, it's because we have different subjective values. That doesn't mean that I'm objectively wrong. So in terms of guardrails, this is a natural place to draw the line. Now, that's pretty abstract. So the next thing I want to do is talk about some concrete examples. Let's start with the phenomenon of impatience. In the United States, we sometimes hear the claim that people don't save enough because they're too impatient. So is impatience an objective mistake? Well, it can certainly lead to mistakes. For example, if an impatient person talks themselves into believing that they can indulge themselves today without future consequences, that's a false belief. That's characterization failure. It's a mistake. But if they simply prefer gratification today over gratification tomorrow, well, that's just a trade-off between their mental states. We can disagree with their trade-off, but we have no objective basis for saying that they're wrong. So let's consider another practical case, potentially controversial. This is the case of the happy smoker. We've all probably known people who say, I understand the health consequences of smoking. I accept the validity of the medical research. I know it applies to me. I know people who have died from lung cancer, and I've watched them suffer. And yeah, maybe I would have been better off if I never started smoking. But now that I'm a smoker, it would be horribly difficult for me to give it up, and I'd be miserable for many years. So I'm going to continue smoking and accept the consequences. So we can disagree with that evaluation. But again, there's no objective basis in this vignette for saying that their decision to continue smoking is wrong. There's no foundation for concluding the characterization failure is present. When mistakes occur, it's then natural to think government policies can make the decision maker better off. But that's less obvious than it seems. So one possibility is that the government could make sure that I get correct information. In this case, make sure that I know that the yellow box contains pears and not bananas, possibly accomplishing this through a public information campaign or through disclosure requirements. And that's called a soft intervention because it preserves my options. To evaluate that kind of policy, we need to consider another principle from behavioral economics, which is that beliefs can be emotionally consequential. For example, I may derive happiness from expecting that good things are going to happen, and I may find pessimistic beliefs depressing. The thing is, different people feel differently about knowing information that makes them feel bad. At one end of the spectrum, the American philosopher Henry David Thoreau declared, rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth. At the other end of the spectrum, the English poet Thomas Gray famously wrote, when ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. Interestingly, our recent research suggests that most people agree with Gray rather than with Thoreau. So let's consider a concrete example, financial planning. Many people avoid it because they find the experience extremely stressful and unpleasant. Now, someone who responds to the stress by being completely oblivious about their financial position is definitely headed for trouble, and they're probably making a serious mistake. But there is a middle ground. Someone can decide to manage the stress of financial decision-making by being reasonably well-informed without being perfectly informed. Sure, they'll make some mistakes. But if the only way to avoid those mistakes is to obsess with finances to the point where they don't relax and take time to enjoy their lives, well then the trade-off favors remaining partially informed. And in that case, if a social architect insists on confronting that person with information and confronting them with reminders, their subjective well-being will suffer. Another possibility in terms of policy approaches is to ban the problematic action. Here, it would be the yellow box in this problem, or to make it unattractive by imposing financial or psychological taxes on it. And that way I end up with the right outcome, here the orange box, even if I hold false beliefs. But this policy implicates another principle from behavioral economics, which is that the choice architecture can also be emotionally consequential. Depending on context, choosing or not choosing can generate a variety of emotions, and you're familiar with them. Guilt, pride, regret, resentment, a sense of empowerment, temptation, and so forth. So taking away someone's freedom to choose can degrade the quality of their subjective experience if it violates their sense of autonomy. And they may be particularly upset if they resent interference by what they might perceive as an overly zealous government official. In that case, the intervention addresses the mistake only by degrading a different aspect of experienced well-being. And by the way, there's reason to think that people do feel this way. For example, there are results showing that nudges tend to lose their effectiveness when people know they're being nudged. They appear to resent it. Now, to make matters even more complicated, the same types of considerations sometimes argue in favor of government intervention rather than against it. In fact, an intervention can be desirable even when people don't make mistakes. Here's an example of that. A smoker is deciding between having a cigarette and refraining. And unfortunately, when he tries to refrain, he experiences temptation, which is really unpleasant, cravings and so forth. And therefore, he gives in and smokes. Now, suppose instead the social architect comes along and bans smoking. In that case, the individual doesn't have to make a decision, and consequently may not feel temptation to the same degree. And as a result, he may end up feeling better off than if he actually had the choice. And again, this is more than a mere theoretical possibility. There is one study that found that when US states increase their tax rates on cigarettes, smokers end up feeling happier. Next, I want to discuss another behavioral phenomenon that's often considered a mistake. Some scholars call it present bias, while others call it weakness of will. The idea is, what if in the moment I put a lot of weight on immediate gratification, even though I'd like myself to be more forward-looking in the future? This case is a lot like impatience, except that my preferences at different points in time are inconsistent with each other. I would like to be patient tomorrow, but I'm going to be as impatient tomorrow as I am today. Now, these sorts of attitudes can also lead to mistakes. For example, I might talk myself into believing that I'll work hard tomorrow even though I won't. That is a false belief, so it's characterization failure. It is a mistake. But let's set that possibility aside and assume that the individual has correct beliefs. Is there still a sense in which weakness of will involves a mistake? And to address that question, I'm going to give a simple example. In this example, I'm going to have lunch at one of two restaurants. The first serves either salad or beef, and the second serves either pizza or chicken. And the twist here is that I have to make reservations at one of these restaurants ahead of time at 10 a.m. Now, the thing is, I'm also weak-willed. So here's the way I rank these four options at 10 a.m. and at noon, and I rank them differently. Okay, at 10 a.m., I'd like myself to eat a healthy lunch. So among these four options, I rank salad first and pizza last. But at noon, when I arrive at the restaurant, I'm self-indulgent. So I rank pizza first and salad last. So the question is, which restaurant will I choose and what will I end up ordering? Okay, well, let's think about what someone would do, what this individual would do when they arrive at the restaurant. If I choose restaurant number 1, given my ranking at noon, which is shown on the left, I will choose beef because I rank beef third and the alternative, salad, fourth. If I choose pizza, and furthermore, if I end up at restaurant 2, I will choose pizza because I rank it first and I rank chicken second. Okay, that's what I will do at noon, depending upon which of these restaurants I go to. Now let's think about this choice from the perspective of 10 a.m., when I'm making my reservation. I understand my preferences. I don't suffer from characterization failures, so I know I'll end up ordering beef at restaurant 1, and I know I'll end up ordering pizza if I go to restaurant 2. So here's how I feel about those choices at 10 a.m. These are the preferences that I put up before, and you'll notice that I rank beef over pizza. So that means that 10 a.m. I'll make the reservation at restaurant 1, knowing that when I arrive at restaurant 1, I'll end up ordering beef. Okay? Question, is that a mistake? Well, let's flip back to the preference rankings. And we see here that beef is my third favorite choice, both at 10 a.m. and at noon. So the question, if we're asking about a mistake, is there an objectively better choice? Well, what about salad? At 10 a.m., I favor salad over beef. But at noon, I favor beef over salad. So that's actually ambiguous. Now, there's a tendency for behavioral economists and psychologists to assume that my self-indulgence in the moment here at noon is always a mistake if it conflicts with my earlier intentions. But that position likely goes too far. And just to motivate that, I want to make 2 observations. First, many people disagree with it. There are many self-help books, as well as philosophies and even cultures, that emphasize the importance of living in the moment and that chastise people for being too future-focused. Conceivably, when consequences are in the future rather than immediate, our assessments are too dry, too abstract, too sterile. Second, anecdotally, when people are on their deathbeds, the regrets they express tend to be that they didn't spend enough time living in the moment, enjoying life with family and friends. Very few people on their deathbed say that they regret not spending more time slaving away at the office. So it's hard to make an objective case that my preferences in the moment are wrong. But it's equally hard to make the case that my preferences about the future are wrong. Fortunately, it isn't conceptually necessary to resolve that conflict. Merely having different preferences at different points in time or under different circumstances doesn't mean that any of those preferences are mistaken. There is a concept in behavioral economics and psychology called preference construction. And here's how I think about this idea. When I make a decision, I have to consider many dimensions of my experience, and I have to weigh trade-offs between them. According to the preference construction hypothesis, I can't do this by accessing stable, well-defined preferences that live inside my head because those don't actually exist. Okay, instead, I have to construct my preference. And implicitly, what I do is assign weights to the various dimensions of my experience. Furthermore, those weights may be sensitive to contextual cues, things like salience, which is why my decisions may not be entirely consistent across different choice architectures. Furthermore, because I don't actually have true preferences, there's no foundation for declaring one set of constructed preferences right and another set wrong. We can simply acknowledge that both are valid judgments. And if we take this position in our example, we can still reach some conclusions. We can still reach the conclusion that beef is a mistake, not by comparing it to salad, because there's ambiguity, but by comparing it to chicken. Although I have different preferences at 10 a.m. and at noon, at all points in time, I would rather have chicken than beef. But I led you through the reasoning here. The individual ends up selecting beef, and that is therefore clearly a mistake. In the behavioral literature, this phenomenon is known as preemptive over-control, simply meaning that in order to stop myself from ending up with pizza, I can't go to the place that has chicken, even though I would prefer it over the beef I know I'm going to eat. Although this is a mistake, it's actually this one, it's not obvious what a social planner would do about it. Now, in discussing mistakes, I've focused quite a lot on people's mental states. And while that's a useful simplification, it is philosophically controversial. The photograph on this slide is a reference to a famous thought experiment, which I imagine most of you know, proposed by the philosopher Robert Nozick. It involves what he called an experience machine. And Nozick asked basically whether simulated experience is just as good as real experience if we never know that it's simulated. So, how are those kinds of issues relevant for economics? Well, here I will offer what I call the parable of the oblivious altruists. And it goes like this. Far, far from the town where this altruist lives, a terrible flood inflicts catastrophic damage on a small village. Now, the government provides relief to the village's residents and pays for that aid by taxing citizens, including the altruist. The altruist would happily pay his share if he knew about the flood. But in fact, he's completely unaware of the flood and will never learn about it. So when he sees his taxes go up, he thinks corrupt politicians are lining their pockets, and this belief makes him unhappy. So now the question, does the relief policy make him better off or worse off? And the answer depends upon your philosophical view of well-being. One school of philosophical thought that's sometimes called welfare hedonism holds that well-being is derived from mental states, pleasure and pain, and only from mental states. And under that view, this policy makes the altruist worse off. He feels worse. But another school of philosophical thought, sometimes called desire satisfaction theory, holds that well-being consists of having one's desire satisfied, whether or not you know it. And in this example, the altruist desires relief to exist when it's needed, even if he doesn't know about it. So according to that view, the relief program makes him better off. Now, surprisingly, these sorts of issues come up in the context of all things, tax policy. Several studies have asked whether people are aware of the taxes they pay. This issue is called tax salience. And on this slide, I illustrate the phenomenon of tax salience in the context of a consumer who wants to buy paper towels, which are taxed at 7%. And there are two scenarios. In the first, the store posts a price that includes the sales tax. And in the second, the posted price excludes the sales tax. Now, research shows that in the second case, people tend to behave as if the tax doesn't exist. So, what are the implications of that observation for policy? Standard economic analyses of taxes emphasize the costs of the distortions they create, how they distort our choices. But if people aren't aware of the taxes, those distortions are going to be very small, and from the traditional perspective, that's good. Okay, that means that the government can raise revenue more efficiently, and moreover, people are happier because they don't think that they're paying taxes. Now, these considerations, if you take them too far, lead to some disturbing policy implications. It means that everyone would be better off if government policy encouraged the obfuscation of taxes. And yet, most of us reject that implication. And one possible reason is that we don't think it's right to let people hold false beliefs, even when correct beliefs have no instrumental benefit. At various points in my discussion, I've emphasized that different people may experience the costs and benefits of behavioral public policies differently. Different people make different types of mistakes. Some may commit errors more frequently than others. Some may resent intervention, while others welcome it. Some may think that ignorance is bliss, while others may want to know the truth at all costs. Another important issue for behavioral public policy is therefore that one-size-fits-all solutions are unlikely to work well for many people. So when evaluating behavioral policies, it's also important to ask whether they accommodate this heterogeneity. So consider the example of nudges that are designed to correct mistakes involving personal saving, like Save More Tomorrow. Usually the motivation for these types of nudges is that many people, not all, but many people save too little from the perspective of their own objectives. But others save too much, and still others get it pretty much right. So the ideal nudge would increase saving by those who save too little, reduce it for those who save too much, and leave the others unaffected. Now, I've conducted a study with a research team that includes Professor Sandro Ambule here in Zurich's Department of Economics, where we've studied the effects of a savings nudge. And briefly, the nudge involves a video that provides an informative explanation of compound interest, the concept of compound interest, which governs the benefits of saving. But it also includes typical motivational rhetoric, such as Albert Einstein is said to have described compound interest as the most powerful force in the universe. We didn't make that up. That is taken from an extremely popular investment manual. So what we find is that although mistakes are heterogeneous, the response to the nudge is not, even though it should be, based on the information that we're providing. People ignore the substance and they respond to the rhetoric. So the intervention looks like a success because savings go up, but on average, it turns out that it's not helpful. All right, I hope that I've managed to convey over the course of this lecture some of the daunting challenges that we face when we try to evaluate whether behavioral public policy interventions make people better off. During the last 2 decades, I've invested heavily in developing methods to overcome some of these challenges, so I'm optimistic that we can succeed. But the complexity and the difficulty of the challenges ought to give the most aggressive proponents of behavioral public policy at least a moment of pause, particularly since policymakers will not be well-intentioned behavioral scientists. Which brings me to my final question. Who is this social architect for whom we are developing these tools? And why do we think they will use the tools in the ways well-intentioned behavioral scientists hope? Will they be geniuses who delve deeply and diligently into all these subtle and complex issues? Or will they be imbeciles who ignore them? Will they be benevolent philosopher kings dedicated to the public good, or self-interested despots? And the answer is probably some of each. And that's precisely why it's important to reach a clearer consensus concerning the liberty-preserving guardrails that ought to constrain government intervention, and in particular for discussions of behavioral public policy to be disciplined by clear, objective, and appropriately narrow conception of what it means to make a bad decision. So thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
So thanks a lot, Doug, for this interesting presentation, provocative and thoughtful. We go now to the question and answer session, and I have the privilege of asking the first question. Shoot. Because you have talked a lot about the guardrails that need to be put on public policy to preserve liberty, and that's clearly a very important topic. At the same time, I mean, nudging is not something that Thaler and Sunstein invented. Private companies, in particular marketing, is all about nudging, I mean, to 80% at least. and not about informing. So what are your views on the guardrails that need to be put on private actors, like private companies that invest in advertising to convince people? And if we take into account that nudges affect behavior, then we also have to believe that these private actors also affect behavior. And maybe then the economists' view that markets are so wonderful instruments for satisfying people's wants is at least partly mistaken, because, I mean, the argument that I sometimes hear is, well, but what if the behaviors, so to speak, the desires are created by the company? So what's your view on that?
Well, I think you're exactly right, and this is a critical question to pose. The intellectual tradition in economics that says markets generate good outcomes assumes that these sorts of psychological influences are not going to be important. And there is nothing in economic theory that I know of that says that when private entities can engage in nudging, that markets necessarily produce these very desirable outcomes that we envision in standard theory. It happens in some special cases, there are some results, but more generally, this is an important issue. So another branch of this literature is very concerned with the question of how do you regulate the private manipulation of nudges, and what standards should we place on that? And this gets very challenging, right? Because there's going to be choice architecture no matter what the government does. And just allowing the choice architecture to happen by accident doesn't seem right. Allowing some private parties to manipulate it in ways that benefit them, that's not right either. So there does need to be an elaboration of how we use these tools to place guardrails on the private usages as well. And some of them are pretty obvious. You know, you can't do something that's outright deceptive. You have to, a lot of the behavioral public policy stuff that's focused on this focuses on disclosures and how to make disclosures clear and easily understandable. Everyone knows how disclosures work, right? You sign an agreement or something, they give you disclosures that go on for 50 pages of fine print, nobody ever reads them. So that's one of the issues. How do you convey that? How do you articulate that in ways where people will understand what they're doing? So I think that that's the focus. It's, you know, again, this principle of trying to help people avoid characterization failure is critical. Helping them avoid, by constraining the private use of these things, avoid contexts, social architectures that lead them to have characterization failure and make mistakes.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I take now a few questions from not this audience here, but the internet audience, and then we open the discussion for the people here. So somebody asked the following question, referring to self-harm. Some people want to light themselves on fire, starve themselves, or jump off buildings, clearly self-harming them. Shouldn't policy intervene? Well,
it's an interesting question, and there is a door in the framework that I've described for policies that would prevent that. But the question that you would be asking is, what are the conditions that are leading to that, and why is the person doing that? Is it because of, is it because of some psychosis where we can objectively establish that the individual is not understanding the relationship between their choices and consequences? We can go to the opposite end of that and talk about the right to end your own life. You know, is that, you might want to prevent people from setting themselves on fire, but do you want to stop people under all circumstances from ending their own lives? And the perspective that I'm expressing would be saying no. In all situations, you don't want to do that. That there are situations in which people understand the consequences of that choice. They've thought about it carefully. They're suffering, and they don't want to continue suffering. So, there are cases where those decisions come from deliberation where someone isn't kidding themselves. There are other situations where, frankly, igniting yourself, these things generally involve mental illness, which I think puts it in a very different category. I don't think many of us have too many objections to more aggressive paternalism in the context of children, for example, or people who lack capacity.
Okay, thanks. There's one question that could be probably representative for how some people think. This person asked, there are plenty of examples how behavioral economic insights either helped or didn't change behavior at all. Are there any examples where behavioral policy unintentionally harmed people?
Unintentionally harmed, well, I did give an example at the end, the nudge that we studied in the study on savings nudges harms some people and hurts others. So the heterogeneity point speaks to that. I think more generally, I'm not on board with the blanket statement that we know for a fact that nudges broadly have helped people. That's based on, in most cases, the preconceptions of the person who's doing the study or reading the study as to what's good and what's bad. And this is precisely what I think we need to give closer attention to. If I thought about it more, I think that I could come up with some examples where there were negative unintended consequences, but I don't have a good example right off the top of my head.
Okay, so let's now open the discussion to the audience here. Are there any questions here? Yeah, here, over there.
Hi. So you talked about disclosures, and I wanted to ask where you see the difference between information and nudging in general, because I feel like it's a very fine line, even how you formulate things.
Right, and this is sort of, definitional, what we're going to put into which bucket. I don't put conventional information policies into the nudge bucket. The reason is that these are completely standard policies that exist in standard economics. Standard information economics, is all about how you can change people's behavior by providing them with more information and make them better. Now, it may be that when you provide them with more information, they don't respond perfectly rationally to that. The terminology we use in economics is responding as a good Bayesian, in the sense of Bayesian statistics. A lot of what people do when they see information is different than what we imagine in the textbooks. So that would be an example of a standard policy. It is an informational policy, just providing people with information, that we might be interested in because of the behavioral responses. In other words, people aren't responding fully rationally, but their response may still be useful. So, these are the distinctions that I make for the purpose of classifying. There's been, I sometimes call it nudge imperialism. The nudge agenda wants to sweep in everything that isn't a tax or a ban. But we've been talking about information policies like disclosures and provision of information for a long time. Nudges I think of as pure choice architecture issues. We're changing the framing of a decision problem, not changing the options that are available.
Okay, other questions? Over there.
Hi, thank you. Your talk somewhat generally rejects the idea that choices are objectively good or bad, and that it's up to the person's preferences as to whether it's good or bad. How does that idea kind of fit into general society and community thinking, and whether the individual choice can override the benefit to a community?
Sure. So, no, this is a very important question. The consequences for others falls into the bucket that economists sometimes call externalities. Mill talked about harm to others. We would call that a negative externality. You can also have positive externalities. So as an economist, I tend to think of impacts on community and community functioning and the well-being of others through the lens of externalities and account for it that way. And certainly, if someone is taking a decision that has negative impacts for their community, then even though it might be something that advances their personal well-being, it's degrading the well-being of others. Clearly, society has a valid interest in stepping in and doing something about those consequences. What I'm focused on is just think about the effect on the individual, all right? When you're evaluating the policy, any policy, it's going to have effects on the individual who makes the choice and potentially effects on others as well through externalities. And we may want to consider both. And I'm really talking about how we think about the effects on the individual. Sure, consider the effects on others, but when evaluating the effects on the individual themselves, be careful about justifying the policy on the grounds that it corrects their decisions unless you have a clear objective definition of what that means. My definition being, is it correcting characterization failure?
Okay. Roberto?
So I think the arguments for why, as long as people fully understand the consequences and aren't subject to characterization failures, you may not want to intervene based solely on preferences. Can you think of a significant choice you've made in your life that you really understood all the consequences of that could potentially matter? And I guess if the answer is, that those choices don't exist, then there seems to always be room for intervention.
So I guess I should say that as an economist, my answer is, yeah, all of them. No, obviously, we don't fully understand a lot of things that we do. We partially understand consequences. That's absolutely true. And you could try to design policies that identify all of those problems all over the place and address them. I don't think that's going to be very successful. The thing that's potentially successful is identifying systematic patterns. It's not, whether you got everything exactly right. It's whether there is a systematic way in which what you're doing and in which other people like you are deviating from what they ought to be doing based on what they would do if they understood something correctly. Those things, you can design policies to correct. But just saying, in this instance I got it wrong by, -2, and in this other instance I got it wrong by +3, well, that's kind of random noise. It's very hard to do anything about that.
Last question there. Then I take the very last, the most popular question from the audience in the internet.
Can't wait.
I have a question regarding the last example with compounding interest rates.
Yes.
So it shows that nudging can be not necessarily good for individuals, but thinking about financial institutions, they might be interested to use this nudging because then they can increase their assets under management. And this is something that is very important usually for financial institutions. And how can we prevent it that uneducated investors, or maybe investors that are not aware about some kind of biases, cannot fall into these traps? Thank you.
Right, that's a very good example of the first question that we were talking about, is private entities like financial firms have an incentive to nudge to get people to do this sort of thing, whether it benefits them or not. They would love the nudge that we studied in this paper. So you expect to see a lot of that sort of thing. Now, again, circling back to public policy, it's very easy to say, well, what we want to make sure is that they don't say anything that is factually incorrect so that people are not, changing their belief from something that's approximately right to something that's wrong. And actually, the nudge that I gave, turns out compound interest, not the most powerful force in the universe. So, you could say that one is deceptive. But generally, we'll look for deceptive things. The problem is that there are so many other things that private entities can do that aren't deceptive, but that do change the framing of choices in a way that, can move people's decisions around, even induce characterization failure, despite the fact that they're not lying. That's very hard to figure out the right way to address those kinds of problems. What you want to do somehow is to block manipulation. But manipulation can be very hard to identify. So we don't have all the answers to that.
Okay, there is here an example of behavioral effects. The very first question that has been asked is the most popular, maybe because it's the very first one, and it asks, what is the most terrible behavioral public policy innovation that you have seen in recent times?
Wow, that's kind of like the question about what's a policy intervention that has made people worse off. And as I said, I don't have a good example lined up for that. The most terrible one. I'm going to give that thought. Next time I give this kind of talk, I'm going to be loaded for bear on that one. But I don't have a good example as I sit here of what I would think of as the worst policy.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have Doug here. Let's applaud him. So let me announce at the very end other events that will take place. On June 20, we will have economic historian Joel Mokyr. He's one of the internationally most well-known economic historians, and he will take us on a journey to the roots of economic prosperity. So he will talk about the roots of economic prosperity. Joel is, like Doug, a great speaker, very lively, so you're all invited to attend that talk, and I hope I can see you there. And you might also watch the UBS Center webpage with all the YouTube videos that we have lined up there. It's, in the meantime, a large list of interesting videos that you might be interested in. And with that, I leave it for today, and thank you very much for coming and participating in the discussion. Thanks a lot.